Well, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around this fact, but I have been studying Chinese brush painting since 1980. And I know that you're going to do the math on that. It's a long time. And I have to say that I still cannot fully comprehend the depth of it. So, what began my journey was a chance encounter in 1980, seeing the Japanese woodblock prints in Monet's home. And it was an aha moment for me. And that was step one of my journey into studying this amazing culture and art form. So it's interesting the connection with Monet because his water lilies, that was always a high point for me. And later on, I'll be telling you about what was Monet's high point. You're going to see the circle, and I think it'll be interesting to you as it is to me. So, another pivotal moment in my life was Andre Malraux reading The Voices of Silence. And this is one of the most important books by one of the most powerful minds of the last century. And it's an inquiry into the meaning of art in general. And guess what? It begins with the Song Dynasty. Now, isn't that amazing? So, Malraux felt that Chinese landscape painting was the highest form of art ever developed. It was the pinnacle of all art. And I would have to agree. I would have to say, yes, I agree. But being a Westerner, how can I perceive this amazing art form? How can I even begin to understand it? So, seeing Chinese, Japanese, Korean art through Western eyes, where do we begin? I was privileged to give a talk to the China Society in early this year, and hopefully this will bring us some clarity. All right, we're going to start with painting in the West. And there was a gradual development through the centuries of both technique and visual understanding, such as the development of perspective in the 15th century. And they discovered the use of a vanishing point and the discovery that objects blurred and faded as they receded. Very, very important. So these huge ateliers, these workshops developed. So by the 17th century, the Flemish Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens did 21 magnificent paintings in the life of Marie de Medici. She was regent of France at the time. Secret, you probably know this, his apprentices did most of the work. So the name artists in these studios were actually supervisors, and they would add the flourishes that would make the work uniquely theirs. So it would come alive with their imprint. So with Rubens, it was usually hands and faces. All right. Through the 18th century, it was unthinkable to simply paint a group of objects for the fun of it. And it wasn't until the Impressionists, it was never about feelings. It was never about the feelings of the artist. And although the early paintings were strictly religious themes, paintings per se, for them, were not a religious experience. So one could say that the Western artist or the guild member of that time was very similar to the palace painters in the East because they were also artisans. And they worked at the pleasure of the emperor, and they painted these meticulous flowers, birds, and insects, and they painted in the gombi or palace style. It was very meticulous, and creativity was never an issue. And the emperor would say, I want 500 butterflies by tea time tomorrow. And That's what would be produced. So in the East, from the beginning, painting was what we would call a religious experience. It was close to an epiphany for the literati or the gentlemen scholars, and they were the ruling class in China. They would be so enraptured that their feelings would just overflow onto the paper, and there was total freedom of expression. And for them, art was a vehicle for expressing these feelings. So you can see one of my paintings showing these gentlemen scholars or the literati, and they would gather together in groups. They would compose poetry, and they would do their beautiful paintings and drink a lot of wine. So that was an important element of their gathering together. So one of my favorite paintings done by Xin Zhu is called Poet on a Mountaintop. And it was done, he lived between 1427 and 1509. So it was the early Ming period. And he would wander about and then come into his studio or his writing area, and he would dash off a painting, and then he would write a poem on it. And I'm just going to read this one poem because I think it's so beautiful. So, white clouds, like a scarf, enfold the mountain's waist. Can you just visualize that? It's so poetic. Stone steps hang in space along a long, narrow path. Alone, leaning on my cane, I gaze intently at the scene and feel like answering the murmuring brook with the music of my flute. Wow. So we not only have a beautiful painting, but we have this expressive poem that further conveys the meaning in the painting. So this expression of personal feeling did not occur in Western art until the Impressionists, beginning with Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet. It was ridiculed at the time. And today, everyone loves the Impressionists for their feelings, these deep feelings that they expressed. But who do the Impressionists love? Now, this brings us about to my experience in Monet's home that started me on my path in brush painting. So a clue for Monet is his discovery of Japanese woodblock prints, the same exact thing, in a Zaandam, Holland grocery store. The grocer was actually wrapping up his purchases in these prints. So of special interest is knowing that these Chinese Buddhist monks took paper, ink, and brushes to Japan, and then the Japanese developed the sumi or ink painting. So Monet later said of that moment, and I'm sure that he felt the way I felt, it was an enchanting day. It was as if life shed something of its complicated indirectness, becoming simpler, clearer, more intelligible, and more beautiful. So that's what Japanese woodblock prints did for Monet, and that's what seeing them in his home did for me. So carved on a wall in the Musée Marmottan in Paris is the following poem by Louise Gillet, referring to Monet's water lilies. Amazing paintings, without drawing and without border, song without words, or art without the help of form. without a sketch, without a story, without a fable, without allegory, without body and face, by sole virtue of tone. It's all lyrical effusion, where the heart speaks, surrenders itself, and sings its emotion. So I think you'd agree with me that Chile could have been describing the Chinese brush painting. Okay, however, when we Westerners look at Chinese brush paintings for the first time, we might experience the same reaction that the early Impressionists received. The same reaction upon seeing a Picasso or Jackson Pollock, a Cy Twombly, Joseph Bayes, or Bruce Nauman, thinking, I don't get it. I just don't get it. To get it is to know it's all about feelings. So these literati were actually the Impressionists and abstract expressionists of their day, centuries ahead of the West. Unlike modern Western expressionists, moral character for the literati was the highest prize, and no matter how abstracted or simplified, the subject of the painting was always clear. In the 11th century, as a protest against various oppressive governments, these literati or gentlemen scholars formulated their ideas and their theory of art. So the requirements for a literati were moral character and intellectual background. This is a quote. If the moral character is not high, there's no way he can handle the ink properly. There should be nothing negative in his mind before he can bring out the wonderful and the unexpected with his brush, such as mist and clouds and beauty, which naturally correspond to the spirit and growth in heaven and earth. And there'll be a lot about that later on. So further quoting, if one is preoccupied with worldly thoughts, he will only be like a lacquerware painter or a palace painter. So that was quite a put down. They would make a distinction between themselves and the artisans and craftsmen at the service of the emperor. So this concept of heaven and earth is so important in understanding Eastern art that I have a seal carved harmony of heaven and earth. We know that painting was highly developed by the Ming Dynasty in the 14th through the 17th centuries and called Shi'e or written idea. For the literati, that's exactly what it was, a written idea. And each brushstroke became a living idea, with emphasis on the energy and the movement of the lines and forms. The flower bird paintings were done rapidly in pomo, or what's called throw ink style, without any drafting lines or sketching. How brave! That's like walking on a high wire with no net. Think of it. So this was based on the 6 canons of painting, and it was written in the 5th century by She Ho, and actually it still forms the basis of Chinese painting today. Number 1, the life force, and that's the circulation of the qi, the breath, the spirit, the vital force of heaven. And this qi produces movement of life, and it's the heart of the artist. 2, bone work. The brushstroke creates structure. And you can see in this painting that I did, I'm actually so proud of it because it was exhibited at the Grand Palais in Paris. And also, a similar painting was in the collection of Gilbert Leong, who is the architect of the East-West Federal Banks. And he was an early patron of mine. he encouraged me so much along the way. And also, Pacific Asia Museum a few years back used another painting of my gourds, very similar to this one, as a fundraiser for the museum. And they were able to raise several $1,000s from it. So you can see why this painting is so special to me on so many levels. But back to bone work, the brush stroke creating the structure. And you can see in the painting all of the, what we would call the stems that deliver the life force to the gourds. All of that is called bone work. And it's a very important technique or stroke used in brush painting. And we see that by creating a slight pressure on the tip of the brush and continuing onward, it creates the look actually of a segment of a bone. So that's one of the things that we look for in a brush painting. It's important to note that the stronger this brushwork is, the stronger the painting is. And character is produced by a combination of strong and lighter strokes, thick and thin strokes, wet and dry strokes, dark and light, and very importantly, rough and smooth strokes. And we want to try and see all of those in one painting or in each painting. So it's important to note that line is for the Chinese what color is to Western artists. And line was the crucial source of basic shapes. And it gives shape to all of the masses that are actually nothing less than abstracted geometric forms, which I find so fascinating. All right, moving along. Around 100 AD, the Shu Wen was a Chinese dictionary that was completed, and it stated that to paint is to draw boundaries. So these lines that were formed with brush and ink remain the critical element of Chinese brush painting, as they make up the rocks and the mountains and the trees and the pagodas. They all must be alive. So the lines are idiomatic and codified, and they should be done deliberately and always spontaneously to give a lively appearance. Now, isn't that a contradiction in terms? You do it deliberately, but yet you're spontaneous. And you're thinking about all these things: thick, thin, rough, smooth, dark, light. Anyway, and you're supposed to abandon everything and be spontaneous. Fascinating. So we see this in this particular book out of the Mustard Seed Manual. We see some of the methods that are used for forming foliage. For example, circles. Now, in the West, we think that we paint leaves looking like the leaf looks. Wrong, erase that. No, you paint a bunch of circles. And maybe for a different tree, you would paint a bunch of triangles. And maybe there's another tree and you would just do a bunch of dots. And those dots are called me dots. And what I suspect, just between us, is that Master Me one day said, you know, I've drawn too many circles. I'm really bored with all of this. This is tiresome. I'm just going to take my brush and do dots. And ever since then, we've been doing me dots. So, on to number 3. According to the object, draw its form. In order to do this, one must connect with the object emotionally. And this produces a work that is not necessarily realistic or botanically correct, but rather as one feels it. So completely unlike the Western artist, who usually has a model of what he's painting in front of him. And my mind immediately goes to the plein air painters working outdoors, looking at scenes,
or some Western artist who would put flowers in front of them, or lemons and oranges and copy and paint. No, no. Instead, these literati would take a stroll in their garden. They would breathe in the wonders about them, and then, being so refreshed, so inspired, they would go in and express the fleeting moment on paper. This brings to mind when I led a group to Japan, and we were in a private home, and the hostess at the end of the day held up this kanji and said to us, "This is a moment in time that will never be repeated." And pow! Wow! To be mindful. So that's exactly what these literati would do. Take a mindful stroll in their garden, really capturing the moment. And then they would paint these amazing works that were truly paintings of the mind and the spirit, but were also truly of a moment. It's just, oh, so exciting. Anyway, now so many, my life is just all serendipity. And one of the most interesting and amazing things that has happened to me, I received a phone call from distinguished filmmaker Philip Haas, and he was calling from London, and he was about to shoot a video the very next day for the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm sure you're all familiar with that museum. So with the Kimball Art Museum, they came up with this really interesting concept. They would pick maybe a handful of paintings in the museum that they felt were especially noteworthy, and they wanted to show alongside of the painting a video of how the artist was dressed, how his studio looked, and all the implements of his studio when he painted the particular work. So the subject of the film they were about to shoot was an early 14th century painting called Chinese Art Taming of the Dragon in the museum's collection. So it was done in this meticulous gongbi or palace court style. So the arats in Chinese, the lohans, were the original disciples of the Buddha, and they were enlightened beings of exceptional wisdom, endowed with supernatural powers. And one of their primary roles is to serve as guardians and advocates of the Buddhist law. So in this dramatic composition, we see a seated arat accompanied by a guardian king, a monk, and a child, and he confronts a dragon as it emerges from a body of water. So the figures are rendered in a fine linear ink technique, while the landscape setting is painted with bolder, much more expressive brushwork, rather in the literati style. So you have the both styles, the gongbi and then the throw ink style in this one painting. From viewing my studio, they were able to obtain a table based on my copy of a 14th century scholar's table. And my chair had to be described as well. I love this chair. It was one of Gilbert Leong's and one of my treasures. For the museum, I suggested that they use several important elements that would be included in the scholar's studio. For one, the brush rack or stand. And this particular piece is so magnificent. It was brought back from China for me as a gift in the early 80s. And I will tell you, it's impossible to be able to find a brush stand of this quality today. The dragons are just meticulously carved. It's so beautiful, and it's one of the treasures that I have in my studio. There are 3 other brush stands, but none as beautiful as this one. And also, this particular container I was able to obtain on my trip to China, and I absolutely love it. It's quite heavy and perfect for holding brushes, but just look at all that intricate carving. And my most favorite love treasure is this magnificent piece, all carved from soapstone. This belonged to my dear mentor and friend Gilbert Leong, who I mentioned was the architect for the East-West Bank many years ago. And look at this carving. It is so beautiful. I treasure this. And it holds a place of honor in my studio. All right, next. Also very important, and as I mentioned, they did not obtain one, but I felt that a viewing stone or a scholar's rock would be very important to have. And more than likely, the gentleman scholar or literati would have that in their studio. And this one is made out of jade and is very, extremely rare, and another treasure that I'm so grateful for. Of course, the slate grinding stone. And here again, we have a beautiful example, this one with the magnificent dragon carving, all of a piece. It's so beautiful. And the artist would take their ink stick, and these are in various sizes and shapes, and many of them, you see this is rectangular, this is a circle, many of them have beautiful artwork on them. So marvelous. This one's rather plain, but it does have calligraphy on it on all sides. And they would take this ink stick and place, notice there's a well here. That's to hold even more water. And they would take some of the water from there, bring it up here, and slowly grind the ink stick until the pasty, beautiful ink would be in this dish. And that takes a good 5 to 10 minutes. And so in patiently grinding their ink, it would be a form of meditation for them. So another treasure in the studio. However, today I use ready-made instant ink. This particular brand is made in Japan, and it's the same exact quality made from ground pine soot, the same quality if I were to grind my own ink, which I used to do years and years ago. The next thing I'd like to show you is from my collection of over 30 mood or side seals. And this one in particular, I had carved to say the chi of the brush after my book on instruction, the chi of the brush. And look at all that intricate carving. Just fascinating. And it's quite heavy. And these mood or side seals would be used to enhance the painting. So this particular one is a favorite. And then I told you about the journey of the imagination, and this was discovered in China, and you can see the intricate carving on it. And again, through an interpreter, we have some bamboo in the back. Look at that. And again, it's quite heavy. Look how beautiful. This is all of a piece. And you can see this looks like a pheasant here. Or it could be a peacock even. I can't tell. Isn't that amazing? And this says journey of the imagination. And one of my favorites is this magnificent piece. And this one says, Poet of the Orchid Pavilion, which is a classic subject. And I want you to see the back of this. Can you see how beautifully that's carved? Just so fine a piece. It's almost impossible to get pieces of this quality today. I don't even know where to find them. Just similar to the brush stand. And finally is my own name chop, which I keep in a very special place because this is my signature. And in the East, these name chops are used even on checks and all important documents. So what did I forget? Of course, there would be a water dish, and this is a handmade piece. And this was done by Leslie Leong, who is the daughter of Gilbert Leong. And isn't that beautiful? Look at that. And also the owner of the art store in Pasadena, California, F. Sui One. Now, isn't that a beautiful piece? I love it. All right, let me tell you just a little bit about brushes. They're all made from animal hair, and they all serve a different purpose. And this is a large orchid bamboo brush. It's made out of wolf or deer hair, and it delivers a very smooth stroke and is used primarily in the flower and bird paintings. And then here we have a brush. This is called a mountain horse. Can you see? Here, the bristles are very, very stiff. And this is used to create wonderful texture for our mountains and rocks in landscape painting. And then we have fine detail brushes. This is called a rat whisker brush. I hope these names don't put you off, but that's what it's called, and that's probably what it is. It's a marvelous, marvelous brush. And many more. I probably have 100 brushes in my collection. All right. A brush like this is not for beginners. These brushes are made out of goat or rabbit hair, and they're very hard to control. They hold a lot of water, and it's difficult to maintain the shape of the brush when you work. And these are used by master painters, and on occasion I feel brave enough to use one of these. So that pretty much tells you, let me discuss the paper. Primarily, when the literati would paint, they would work on paper similar to this. And can you see, let me see, you can see through it. I don't know if you can see through it here. Anyway, it's very thin and absorbent, which is why one has to work very rapidly on it. Now, for a landscape painting, paper with a little bit more substance to it would be used. And also, they painted on silk a lot. So the paintings would either be done on silk and then later mounted onto a scroll form, or they would be done on paper such as this, which is made out of mulberry. And the mulberry paper is really the finest. So I think I've described everything that you would see in a literati or gentleman scholar's studio. All right. I gave them a sketch, and in my sketch I indicated the proper way to hold the brush. However, I'm sorry, the actor found it more helpful to watch my painting videos on YouTube. And so you can see here a picture of him watching me paint. I don't know. That whole thing just really cracked me up. Back to the six canons. Get serious now. 4. According to the nature of the object, apply color. And it's important to note at this point that black is considered to be a color in the East, and the range of shadings that it's capable of in the hands of a master painter creates an impression of colors. And if color is to be used, it's always true to the subject matter. But now here's the thing, it's always pale by comparison to the use of color in the West, because they thought that the use of color was an emotional extravagance. So this intellectual view arose because the principle of detachment came to be seen as the basis of emotional control. This was so important for them, to have their emotions under control. And that's why we see so many ink-only or monochromatic Chinese brush paintings, and also, of course, in Japan and Korea, who copied the Chinese. In the 9th century, art historian Zhang Yan'an described ink painting. Quote, now, yin and yang fashion and form all things. Grasses and trees may display their glory without the use of reds and greens, and clouds and snow may swirl about, and that's without the use of white color. Mountains may show greens without the use of blues and greens. And for this reason, a painter may use ink alone, and yet all 5 colors may seem present in his painting. So here is one of my landscape paintings, and as you can see, it's ink only. So textured ink strokes build the painting, and this is called UMO UP, to have ink, to have brush. Number 5. Organize your compositions with the elements in their proper place. So space is used in brush painting exactly the same way objects are used. So space then becomes an integral part of the composition. So it's very important to keep at least 1/3 of the painting blank. And this idea of space being so important. And in our landscape paintings, the idea of the mist would equate this area of space in between objects. And in the flower bird paintings, for sure, you would try and leave at least 1/3 of the paper blank. So it's really important. So number 6, in copying, it's important to seek to pass on the essence of the master's brushstrokes and his methods. So remember I mentioned earlier that each brushstroke is considered to be a living idea. So to these literati, copying was considered most essential, and it's only when the artist fully learned the time-honored techniques and formulas would they then branch out into areas of individual creativity. So if we look at it this way, we would copy a master's paintings for maybe 10 years or so. And when I say copy, I mean meticulously. Each circle, each dot, each dash would be copied. And then perhaps 10, 15 years later, we would start doing work that we would title in the style of. And maybe when we hit 90 or something, eventually we would be able to do our own thing. But this idea of copying is so essential to really understanding what is going on. Now, to prove this point, there's a very, 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 very famous painting in the Met in New York. It's titled Riverbank, and it was painted by Dong Yuan, and he was an early 10th century master, and actually the founding patriarch of the Southern School of Landscape Painting. It's very important. Okay, there's the painting, and here's the dilemma. Is Riverbank an important 10th century work, or is it a modern fabrication? So books and seminars on this have still not answered this question. Curators and scholars continue the debate. I have books in my studio on this, and we still do not know. Here's the important thing to know. Even if it's a copy, it's still considered a brilliant work of art, and it would still hang in the museum. So that's how important these copies are. And you know, the Louvre every year always has artists that they select to come in and copy paintings, but those copies would never be hung there. So this is just exactly the opposite. So what have we learned here? At the heart, at the very heart of Chinese artistic endeavor, now remember, I'm speaking of the literati, not the palace painters. So at the heart of their artistic endeavor is this traditional practice of copying works by ancient masters. So a good painting, like good calligraphy, is considered to be a heart print. Wow, let's just think about that for a minute. A good painting, like good calligraphy, is considered to be a heart print. Wow, and that graphically expresses the artist's psychic identity. Wow, now I'm saying these words, I know these words, and yet it's hard for me to even wrap my mind around that because it's, mind expanding. Anyway, moving on. So, as I mentioned, a successful forgery is not only a technical triumph, it's also a psychological coup. Whoa! So you would copy, you would paint in the style of, and finally you would do your own thing when you had all of that nailed. So at this point, it's really important to note that calligraphy in the East has always been the highest art form. It's actually much more difficult than painting, than Chinese brush painting, I have to tell you that. In fact, one style of calligraphy called grass or running style, it's so abstracted that only calligraphers at the highest level can even read the characters. And I'm going to show you a scroll that is in my studio. And this was done when with a group that I led in China in one artist's studio. I thought it would be so wonderful to have a scroll, a calligraphic scroll that said Journey of the Imagination, because that's what I named the trip, the Journey of the Imagination. And this was all through an interpreter, and he looked at me very intently, and through the interpreter, no, can't do it. And I'm thinking, what do you mean you can't do it? Why not? And he said, I'm going to give you something even better. I'm going to give you a 2,000-year-old poem that's about going on a journey. And along the way, many wonderful things happen. And that's exactly what this scroll says. Now, remember when I spoke about running style or grass style writing, how difficult it is to read? So today, people who can read calligraphy, unless they really have years and years and years of study, they're unable to read this. However, they would be able to pick out one or two characters. And because of that ability, they're able to know that this is that 2,000-year-old poem. Now, how literate. That totally knocks me out. Anyway, I'm just so amazed by that. And that has become one of my treasures. So, uh, the first two subjects growing out of this amazing calligraphy were bamboo and the Chinese orchid. And these two subjects are part of the Four Gentlemen or Four Seasons paintings, and the other two being the plum and the chrysanthemum. And here you see my notebook on the Four Gentlemen or the Four Seasons. And I have to just say that for the bamboo, it's so highly prized just by all, both the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, by the characteristics of the bamboo, the fact that it bends, it yields, and it doesn't break. And I'll talk more about that later on. So we can say at this point that Chinese brush painting is meant to be more than just mere representation of an object. And it's most importantly a symbolic expression. And that's why a full painting is never represented, but only a few blossoms. So you would see a plum branch. And this plum branch is really thought that it represents all of plumdom. And in fact, this branch represents all of life itself, which is a Tao principle. And that's why it's done without looking at the subject, but rather bringing it forth from your mind and from your heart, and becoming, in the process, we become part of nature. So there's an expression from heart to arm to hand to brush to paper. So these men, the literati, created environments that nurtured the soul, and it actually protected them from the encroachment of the world at large. And their whole life was an art form. And we can see this today in the gardens they created, and the most famous gardens being in Suzhou. And those of you who have been fortunate enough to go to the Huntington and see their amazing Chinese garden. It's based on a garden in Suzhou, and in fact, workers from that area actually built that garden, and it's such a gift to the community and really to the world at large. So people from all over the world come to see it. Now, this may surprise you, but literary and artistic women were accepted in these elegant gatherings, and they would paint, and as I said before, they would write poetry, and guess what? Romantic marriages would develop. And the saying went, quote, "Only extremely gifted men are capable of deep interest in women," close quote. What do you think of that? One literati said, quote, "Painting is the expression of subtle observation and untrammeled thinking in the broad minds of the noble and cultured literati." So these individuals saw themselves as the very embodiment of moral, intellectual, and artistic perfection. And they were very protective of their elegant and selective world. So they saw art as a reflection of cosmic order, and the apex of their work was high moral values. Art served the way. So here we have another of my paintings, and it shows these gentlemen scholars just hanging out. That's what they do. You can see the scroll. They would write poetry, they would do calligraphy, they would paint, and I don't know if you can see the little wine cup floating on the lotus leaf, but they would drink a lot of wine. I'm just saying, they would drink a lot of wine. So taking delight in their amateur status meant they didn't have to please patrons, and they were free to enter that wonderful realm of the Tao, the way. And one form of escape in art was a retreat to the past. And so the more allusions to the past, the more sophisticated the work was. And this Chinese literati painting, they're referred to as silent poetry. Remember, they'd write poetry, but then the artwork was referred to as silent poetry. And the artwork is divided into two basic categories. So we have flower and bird painting, and it's always expressionistic. And then we have landscape painting, which is lofty and highly stylized and actually given to very complex scenes, as compared to the flower bird paintings, which are of a moment, and 1, 2, 3, you put your thoughts on paper. So this landscape painting, remember I mentioned very early on about Andre Malraux and how he considered Chinese landscape painting to be the pinnacle of art, of all art that ever was, maybe ever will be. So this landscape painting is considered to be the highest subject, and it was thought to be the representation, the actual representation of the artist's soul. Back in the 5th century, Tung Pi wrote, "A painting could have the same spiritual vitality as the scene it depicts." And he said that each element of a painting has its own vital force. So can we just stop for a moment and think about that? The painting, a flat dimensional work, can have the same force as the actual scene. That's really something to kind of ponder over. So, moving on. The name for landscape painting is shuan shui, or mountain water. And mountains and water or mist appear in almost every landscape painting. And we view in these landscapes no sense of perspective, no sense of scale, no sense of light source. And this is why the paintings can look strange to Western eyes. Remember, I started out by telling you that there's none of that where the sun's coming from, where there would be shadows, just none of that. And so we would have 1,000 miles that could be compressed into a single scene. And nature is always supreme. However, it's never to be copied. These are all images of the mind. It's not, they did not go out and copy nature. Never, 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 ever. So I want you to keep that in mind. An important book that's still in print today is the Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting, and it was first written in 1697. I have it in my studio, and I recommend every beginning brush painter get a copy of the book, and actually anyone interested in understanding these paintings in depth, I recommend that book. You can just go to Amazon and get it. All right. So in this book, they list draping hemp fiber among a repertoire of 16 different texture patterns. So this draping hemp fiber would be a way of doing line work to form a mountain. And also along this way of thinking, leaves, as I mentioned leaves before, leaves are reduced to a calligraphic formula of repeating these pattern-like clusters. And so you could have leaves that are just dots. Remember the me dots? Or the leaves would be circles or triangles or whatever. But it was a formula, a strict formula of repeating pattern-like clusters. So to own a scroll by a previous master, one would assiduously study it and actually take a vacation through the scroll. And that was thought that you didn't need to go far afield or take a week or two off. No, you could take a vacation by strolling through the landscape, and it would tell a story. So each brush stroke, each and every, even if there's thousands of brush strokes, would be a defining move that would be examined And the methods used to convey these elements, again, back to the me dots for foliage, would be examined. Also, say the spread out hemp fiber wrinkles. These were texture wrinkles that portrayed mountains. And these are basically two of the aesthetically archetypes or elements that would be copied. So very, very important to understand this archetype or emblem, each thing, emblem of each thing. For example, the pine tree is employed to not just be a tree, no, but to depict moral principle, power, and inner human principle, and inner human potential, the symbol of a man of virtue in the wilderness to the recluse scholars in the Tang dynasty. That was about 618 to 907. And here you thought it was just a pine tree. No. Much, much more. So by the late Ming dynasty, that was, say, 1368 to 1644, landscape modeling techniques were codified into this elaborate set of graphic formulas, and they were known as contexture methods. And it was not unusual for the artist or for an inspired owner of a scroll to write a poem on it. Can you imagine that? In fact, if the emperor or another person of high stature owned the work, they would place their personal seal or their chop right on the work. And boom, boom. And all the successive owners would do the same thing, and maybe they write poems on it. And so we see here so much calligraphy. And look, oh my goodness, look at all those seals. So this is so useful today when scholars and curators determine the provenance of a painting. They can tell by each seal that they see exactly who owned the painting, and they can follow the journey of that painting through time. And that is so fascinating. I mean, that does not happen. Can you just picture owning a Monet and loving it and writing your name on it? How would that work? It just doesn't happen. So back to this concept of metaphors in a painting. It's so important in understanding Chinese painting. So these towering mountains that we see in these monumental landscape paintings are actually a highly personal expression because of their symbolic imagery. They are so poetic and highly personal, being covered in mist, and below them we see a tableau of vents with every element being a metaphor for the contemplative soul. And they become a form for feeling in the artist's heart and mind. So this particular painting of mine is a copy of a copy of a copy of a famous painting. And I made my own additions to it. I added a boatman, a solitary boatman, and a figure on a little donkey, and also pagoda in the distance, in order to tell the story, I think, just a little bit more fully. So it's important to keep in mind that human figures, any man-made structure such as boats and pagodas, are very, very, very small in order to indicate the reverential dominance of nature over man. This is just the opposite. So in the West, man dominates nature, and quite the contrary. Everything is in reverse. So here we see a dominance of nature over man, always little figures, very, very small. So when we see a little man in a boat, a solitary fisherman in a boat, I bet you think that's someone who went fishing. No, it isn't. It isn't at all. We're to understand that this is a literati, gentleman scholar, who has completely withdrawn from public service during a turbulent time and living a life of seclusion and self-cultivation. So that's what that little man in the boat means. And you'll never look at a brush painting in the same way again, I'm sure. Okay, also, this void or large empty area can be a metaphor for a troubled world. So we just see a void, they see a metaphor for a troubled world. And going on to different living creatures, a crane is a symbol of longevity or actually immortality, and it evokes a transcendental meaning, and it elevates this image to something otherworldly. And so because of this, crane paintings were often given as gifts, and especially birthday gifts. A crane painting is a wonderful thing to receive. All right, let's go way back to the 3rd century, the 6 dynasty poets of the 3rd century. They were so much admired and copied quite a bit. And a member of the group was called the Sages of the Bamboo Grove, lived a life of dourest retreat from society. And all of the literati trace their landscapes to this dynasty. Isn't that amazing? All right, on to Nizan. He lived in the 14th century, and Nizan was one of the 4 great masters of the Yuan era. And I suspect he's arguably, probably, the most copied and revered. And Nizan was so great because he was free, he was fearless, he was bold, he was daring, and he was paradoxical. And his goals were simplicity, purity, and loftiness. And it's said of him that he used ink like gold, meaning that he used it very sparingly. And actually, when I teach landscape, the first artist that we study is always Nizan. So our Nizan, he thought that drafting skills were best left to the palace painters. He would show an idealized world free of human figures. That's why I had to add mine. Many artists that followed him felt exactly the same way. And he felt that the scene should be untrammeled, untainted by any appearance of human influence. So his flattened, faceted, ephemeral forms continue to be copied. And as I say, certainly by me and by my students. So Nizan and earlier artists, poets were used as first-hand models to evoke this spirit of antiquity. So a painting based on Nizan or another Yuan master might also bear a literary reference from an earlier time to establish the work as a continuous transmission from the divine beginnings of landscape painting. So remember again, this heaven and earth concept keeps repeating and repeating. And also this literary reference. Remember, I told you about the calligraphic scroll in my studio, and it was a literary reference to a 2,000-year-old poem. So you can see how important these traditions are continuing to today. So we know that during the Zhou dynasty, and that was 1027 to 256 BC, way back there, mountains represented, again, cosmic pillars or shafts that connected heaven and earth, the harmony between heaven and earth. In the mountains, male and female forces would meet, and because immortals were thought to reside in these mountains, a viewer of a Chinese landscape painting should journey through the interiors of the mountains. And here in my painting of Mountains of Tibet, we see exactly that mystical thought of heaven and earth, this coming together. So this type of painting became a psychological self-defense in a turbulent, menacing world, and especially because Nisan lived at a time when the alien Mongol armies of the north ruled China. So he was a symbol of passive resistance, and actually even to this day. So as a protest against these various oppressive governments, or we're just going to pick on the invading Mongol hordes again, the literati, these gentlemen scholars. And remember, these were men who were highly placed in the government. They would retreat, they would back away, they would not get involved in resistance. And actually, they compared themselves to the bamboo. Remember, I said earlier, the bamboo, because it bends, it doesn't break. So they would withdraw to their homes, and they used painting as a form of expression, and it would speak of their longings for a better time. It would speak of their missing a particular place or a friend who had departed. So an 8th century poet said, quote, "When injustice occurs, one sings out." And sing out they did with this silent poetry that blended the pictorial, the calligraphic, and the poetic. And here in one of my paintings, we can see some of these huts where they would withdraw to contemplate and do these very, very expressive paintings. So it was said that if anyone discusses paintings in terms of formal likeness, his understanding is nearly that of a child, close quote. So interesting. Formal likeness was not something to be valued. Hermetism for them became a means of mentally transforming one's environment. So a minor hermit was shown in the mountains and woods where it was easy to transform your environment. However, a major hermit was pictured in the heart of the city. So if you were able to really close out the world, being surrounded by the bustle of the city, you were a major, big-time hermit, and well done. And so in this painting of mine, we see, I guess he'd be called a minor hermit because he's in the woods. He has his tree and a brook, and he's contemplating life. So he would be considered minor. So entering this hermetism without the support of external things and with his heart at rest, there was a total union with the Tao. So an interesting work would be emerging. And because of this, the viewer would have a sympathetic response. And the viewer, too, would respond with his heart, his spirit, and his essence when looking at the painting. Because remember, they would really study these paintings. They'd really live in them. And they would make these paintings part of themselves, their own spirit, soul, and their own nature. So we can now see that this brushwork assumes greater importance than the actual shapes represented. And we become aware of the rhythms, the patterns, and the variations of the painter's brushwork. And the idea was to capture the essence or spirit of nature. And this became the highest state of ultimate enlightenment, which came as a sudden flash of insight into the nature of reality. Along these lines, Dr. David Viscott told of being enlightened at the age of 14. Walking down the street, he felt a presence. It was a connectedness, and he could feel the presence of each star as a sun in its own right, and he could feel its energy. He felt every blade of grass and every leaf as an entity in its own right. And this all happened at the same time without his even thinking about it. And at the same time, there was an incredible peace. And he knew that the answer was part of the knowing. And he knew that the moment was sacred. He stood in that state of grace for about 15 minutes with an enormous sense of love for everything and everyone. And he knew that there was no battle and that he had already won. No matter what would ever happen, he would turn out okay. Now, how very Chinese is that? Well, a poem that I wrote when I first started brush painting so many years ago. It was for a scroll that was to be exhibited in China, and I felt it would be appropriate to write a poem. And you can see that I chose to do a crane because, again, the symbol of longevity. And my poem is, "You of the East and I of the West have already met in the garden of our friendship, where we share together the harmony of heaven and earth." With that hope that we all share this harmony of heaven and earth, I wish you joy.